Welcome to Embedded. I'm Alicia White. My co-host is Christopher White. Do you remember your favorite calculator? Was it RPN or Infix? HP or TI? We all have our favorites. And boy, do we get passionate about them. Our guest this week is Bradon Wilson. He has been hacking TI calculators for years. He's here to tell us about it.
Hi, Bradon. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
As you might notice, I did in fact swallow a frog. I believe Christopher and Bradon, taking the challenge, also swallowed frogs. So it might be a little scratchy here, but we have lots to say. So Bradon, could you tell us about yourself?
Yes. Well, I like to primarily think of myself as a software developer. You know, writing code's something I've been doing since middle school, ever since I got my first graphing calculator. Which that was over 20 years ago. So that's what got me into low-level programming and optimizations, which I think kind of gave me an advantage over people, who are starting out with scripting languages or really high-level stuff that hides so many details from you. So, I really wanted to focus in on that kind of thing. And that got me thinking about attacking devices from a security perspective, because there are plenty of legitimate reasons you might want to do that. And that got me into the security industry. And so that's kind of where I'm at now.
Cool. I want to do lightning round, where we ask you short questions and we want short answers. And if we're behaving ourselves, we won't ask how and why and tell us more. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
What is your favorite calculator?
The TI-84 Plus Silver Edition.
Do you prefer to complete one project or start a dozen?
I would prefer to complete one, but I always start a dozen.
Hacking, freaking, engineering, or programming?
All of the above.
RPN or Infix?
Infix.
Favorite hex editor?
XPI.
Favorite fictional handheld computer?
Fictional. Gosh.
That makes it a little harder.
Let's say the hand link from Quantum Leap.
It's right. Is there Ziggy? The last one. See?
Yeah, it was on your list. Okay, so maybe a longer question. Let's go with calculators, because when I mentioned we were going to have the show, a friend said, well, why do you need a calculator these days? Everybody has their phone. What kind of calculators are you talking about when you say calculator?
Graphic calculators, specifically ones made by Texas Instruments. So, especially in high school, you'd see the really big, tall ones that had a big screen that you could graph equations on it, and depending on your exposure to it, maybe play games as well. So, definitely the more advanced ones, not little scientific ones.
But I have a graphing calculator even on my phone. Why can't people just use their phones?
They could in a professional environment, but where it really matters is in school, like in high school. When I was in high school eons ago, graphing calculators were really all you had. Cell phones weren't really a thing, and you certainly couldn't bring them in the classroom, and you couldn't bring computers in the classroom. But the one thing you were allowed to have was the graphing calculator. So if you could make it do something more than what it was advertised to do, you were on top.
You probably don't want you bringing Wikipedia to your exam either.
Yeah, exactly.
And so these calculators are programmable.
Yes, they are capable of running programs written in a language that TI made up. It's called TI Basic. It's pretty similar to BASIC. They just it pretty much just lets you execute the built-in commands that are on the calculator, including graphing equations and that kind of thing. But they do have some limited features that allow you to make really simple games and that kind of thing. It's really used for making quadratic equation solvers and things like that. But there are people who make games in that language. But the more interesting language would be assembly language. You can write programs in assembly language and flash applications in assembly language on it, which are much more powerful because that gives you access to all of the hardware on it.
But TI doesn't want you to do that.
Actually, they kind of do. the first graphing calculator to ever run assembly programs natively was the TI-85, and that came out in the early 90s, I believe. And the story, there's some rumors. The story goes that people internally at TI actually placed bets to see how long it would take somebody to actually hack it in order to run programs on it. And somebody over there won that bet because we did figure it out. It was done through backing up the memory on the calculator. You can actually back it up to a computer, and that image is basically just a dump of RAM. And the operating system stores some menu entry addresses in that backup, so you can actually manipulate those and cause it to execute code somewhere else. And that was used to execute a shell that was called Z shell, and that program allowed you to run other programs. So that was the first stepping stone into being able to write assembly programs on the calculator. So initially, they actually did want that. And then later on in other models, they actually added easier to use backdoors to make it easier to do that kind of thing. They're kind of exploring the interest and seeing if people really wanted to do this, and it turns out they absolutely did. And later on, they made it so that you could not only write programs without having to hack it or anything, but you could actually create Flash applications. You could even charge money for them. And so it definitely came a long way since the TI-85.
So there's like an app store for my calculator?
There was. They actually stopped making. They actually stopped charging for those applications, but you actually can go to their website and you can download applications to do all sorts of things. They've got little organizers. They've got periodic table programs. They've got programs to extend the math capabilities of the operating system, and they even have a couple of games. So they have all sorts of things on there, and that started at least 15 years ago. So it's something that's been around a long time.
I can understand wanting to program a small program into my calculator in the basic program. There have been times when I've had quadratic equations or more complicated things that fed into each other. And so if I was going to take a test or something, it would be nice to have it be all in one place. But one of the reasons people are using these calculators is because it is at a test setting or at a school setting. And so how does TI balance their insistence that their calculators are cheat-proof with encouraging people to write Flash programs?
That's something that's kind of evolved over time. Initially, they didn't place any restrictions at all on what programs could be run because they were all programs that ran in RAM. And if the programs were unstable for whatever reason, it would just reset memory and you'd be good to go. But later on, they started adding Flash. They started adding a Flash memory to these calculators, which meant that programs could persist and survive memory resets, RAM resets. And at that point, they needed to start adding protections into their calculator to prevent copying programs that cost money, for example. So they needed some way to lock down the Flash memory, which is where these applications are stored. And the way they did that is they implemented some hardware protections so that it wouldn't be possible to run programs in Flash memory unless you had a specific signing key that you could use to sign your application and then install it. And the same with their operating systems. Those were signed with a particular key so that you couldn't simply make patches to their operating system or install your own operating system. And so it was important to protect their own operating system so that you couldn't bypass those Flash unlock and execution protections, so that people could just buy an application once and then find out how to copy it and then give it to the whole world. So that was one of the first challenges they had to solve. And so they did that through that Flash unlock protection. And then later on, when people started to find ways of writing programs that would help them cheat, like on tests, they had to come up with other mechanisms. And one of them is called Testguard, or that's actually an application that teachers can run on their own calculators, and they can connect it to student calculators and initiate a process that locks down the student's calculator in a particular way so that they couldn't execute programs or Flash applications, and they couldn't even open like TI basic programs, for example, because they could, they could type notes in there to help them on their test or whatever. And there's also something called press to test. It's kind of a similar, a related feature where they could actually press a certain key combination on the calculators and put it in that same mode and lock it down.
Well, couldn't you just use a different key combination to unlock it?
You could modify the OS to do that. It's that's where the cat and mouse game really started. But one of the big problems that I have with that particular piece of functionality is that once it's in that mode, how do you get it out of that mode?
Yeah, that was what I was thinking.
And what they came up with is they made it so that it would unlock itself if you were to initiate a file transfer while it was connected to a computer. So in other words, the only way to unlock it would be to connect it to a computer. So if your calculator was put in that mode, you can't get out of that mode unless you can connect it to a computer. And that might be good in a test-taking setting because no one has a computer with them in order to unlock it.
Yeah, as a teacher, that would be reassuring.
Yeah, but it's bad for other students because, and I can speak from experience because when I was in high school, this happened to me. I was kind of the calculator guy. I was the one that had all the calculators. I had all the games. I could hook you up. If a class was, if I had a substitute teacher and it was particularly boring that day and there was nothing to do, you came to me and I could help you out and you could play games in class. So what they would do is people who didn't, let's just call them acquaintances. I didn't particularly like them, but I'd let them use it. Just, to get them away from me. So they play games on it. And then when they were done, they would actually clear the memory on it, or they would press that key combination and lock me out. So I couldn't play games. I couldn't do anything until I got home that day.
How rude.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. So the way that they came up with that sort of protection, I had a problem with. And that's one of the reasons why I broke it is because I wanted to be able to, do what I wanted with it. Once the test was over or once they were done, thinking they were locking me out or whatever. So that could be through installing my own key combination to unlock it on its own, or changing the functionality for that key combination so it looks like it's locked down, but it's really not, or kind of a fake memory reset thing, make it look like the memory's reset, but really everything's still there. Or maybe it appears like it's all missing until you press a secret key combination and then it all comes back. So I would be able to trick that guy who wanted to hurt me, and he thought he succeeded, but really I could still do what I want. So I guess I'm saying there's good reasons for being able to circumvent these protections, and of course there's also bad reasons. So
one of the things you said was that the teacher could push something on their calculator and it would go to all of the students' calculators. Mm-hmm. Are these Wi-Fi capable?
Some of them are, yeah.
It's a calculator. Okay. Yeah. Oh, is it also infrared or is it just Wi-Fi for that sort of thing?
It's just Wi-Fi. There are people who there's an I/O, a 2.5 millimeter link port on it, and people have abused that to do all sorts of things. That's the standard, at least on the older models. That was the standard way of linking them to a computer, but you could do other things with them. You could link them to other calculators. You could hook up an infrared LED. You could actually play sound through them. There's all sorts of things you could do with that board.
So how did you learn to hack these and program them? Was it widely known which processor was in them? Certainly the memory map for peripherals and stuff wasn't available, was it? Or did you just have to discover this stuff?
To some extent. Initially, we had to discover it. And I think we may have kind of impressed them on how much we figured out on our own, because once we had the ability to execute code on it, we started immediately dumping the operating system, looking at how it interacts with the hardware and making educated guesses about how to interact with the LCD, how to quickly and efficiently make grayscale games, how to interact with different parts of the hardware. In later models, they actually have USB ports, and so we looked at the operating system to see how they interacted with their USB controller. We basically looked at what the OS did and figured out how it was able to interact with a computer and other peripherals, and then recreate it. So a lot of it is just straight up reverse engineering.
When you say looked at, are you using something like IDA, a decompiler, or hex editing? What does looked at mean?
Disassembler, yeah, like IDA, or there are some other, and you got to keep in mind this is a long time ago, back when IDA was really a thing. So, but yeah, we would use that. We would use other disassemblers. We didn't really need to decompile anything because the memory and the operating system was so primitive that it wasn't written in C or anything. It was written in assembly and Z80 Zlog Z80 assembly, and we were looking at it the same way. So, I don't know if it's Zlog or Zilog. I've always said Zlog, but
I always said Zilog, but I've never actually heard anybody say which it was definitive.
Who could say definitively?
The company.
All right.
Let's call them up.
That's true.
I think it actually is Zilog, but I prefer Zlog.
So they're still Z80 based?
Most of them are, yes.
That's amazing. That chip has lived forever.
Yeah. There are, across all of them today, there are 4. There is the Z80, which is first, and then the Motorola 68K for some of the more advanced models. And the Inspire series uses ARM. And the latest 84 Plus series, which is called the T84 Plus CE, that's the one that has the color screen. That one uses an extension of Z80 called EZ80, and it is uses 24-bit addressing, and it has it's laid out differently than the Z80 ones. It has a flat memory model. The hardware, the protection hardware is completely different. It's brand new. Actually, there was no disassembler for it, so I had to write an IDA plugin to support it so that I could start looking at the OS. So it was relatively unknown.
I haven't really used IDA. I only know about it from Scanlime's Coaster Melt series. What are the disassemblers that exist? What else would I be looking at? Like if I wanted to do something like this, what are the tools I need?
IDA is without a doubt the best one there is.
But it's expensive.
It's expensive, yeah. But if you can get your hands on it, I highly recommend it. The main community website is called ticalc.org, and it has some Z80 disassemblers. Especially once people wrote themselves. So there's some good resources there. There are actually some on-calculator disassemblers. So you can disassemble the operating system while you're on the calculator and look at the instructions that are being executed, as well as manipulate memory, RAM or flash at any point. So we've come a long way in terms of utilities that we can run on the calculator to help with reverse engineering and programming.
But one of the things you have to do in order to run the flash was those keys. You said that to run things, you had to have keys.
Yeah.
You broke the keys. How did you break the keys? How does one break keys?
Well, for many years, we knew that was highly unlikely. Trying to break keys is not something your average high school student is going to be able to do. So we knew that we weren't going to be able to do that. So initially, what we did was we worked around it. We knew that the code that actually performs these operating system updates on the calculator was in a boot sector on the flash chip, an area that's supposedly read-only, that contains all the code necessary for receiving an OS update over that I/O port or over USB, and actually writing it directly to the flash chip. So we knew the code that it would take in order to do it. We just didn't have the privileges to be able to do it. One of the things that protects those calculators is something we call flash unlock protection. There's an ASIC inside the calculator that is responsible for all the I/O that the processor performs. So any hardware like the keyboard, the LCD, that I/O port, things like that it interacts with, it all goes through that, and including modifying the data on the flash chip. And there is a particular sequence of commands that you need to be able to execute in order to unlock the protection on that flash chip so that you can write and erase commands to that flash chip. And those commands have to be run before you can do it. There's a special sequence that unlocks it and a special sequence that locks it back. And the boot sector will do this whenever it performs an OS update. But the thing about those instructions is that those instructions have to execute from what they call a privileged page of the flash chip. And naturally, the only privileged pages would be the ones that the boot sector's on, so which is theoretically read-only. So you can't manipulate it. You have to get it to execute it. So what we would do is we would manipulate various aspects of the calculator, registers and memory, so that we could actually jump directly into the code that would unlock the flash chip. They would execute those privileged instructions. And once it did that, we would then steal away control from the calculator, from the boot sector. We would steal control away before it had a chance to lock the flash chip back. And once we did that, then we had control. Then we could modify the OS. We could install our own applications. We could do whatever we wanted. And we call that flash unlock exploits. So that is what we relied on initially before we had the signing keys.
Who is we in this story?
The community as a whole. I was not the first to come up with flash unlock exploits. I may have been the first to publicize them. The people who initially did it were really just kind of tinkering around, learning more about the hardware. They didn't necessarily want to release those exploits because, for whatever reason. But I knew that there would be value in being able to install our own OSs. And that's something I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to install my own operating system. I wanted to be able to write one and install it, and as well as write my own Flash applications. So on those calculators, Flash applications have certain privileges that regular RAM programs don't have. One of the big things is that they can actually persist in memory, so they're more stable. So if the calculator crashes or it resets or something, you don't lose it. It's still there. So it's a convenience thing. There's lots of reasons. There's lots of technical reasons why you would want to do that. But once I had that, then I started developing tools that would allow you to install your own OS and that sort of thing using those unlock exploits. But there is a better way. It would be nicer if we actually had the signing keys. That way we wouldn't have to rely on these ugly exploits that might only work on certain OS versions or certain hardware versions. It would be better to have the keys. And on these particular calculators, they use 512-bit RSA keys, which by today's standards is a joke, but we're talking 1997 where computing power was not what it is today. There's no way you could factor those keys. And that's what it would take. We would have to factor an extremely large. That's basically what RSA is. That's the strength in RSA. You need to be able to factor a very large number into primes, and computing power just couldn't be done at the time. But fast forward, let's say 10 years, one person in the community, not me, somebody else in the community managed to actually factor one of the keys. They were curious, and they had looked into the math behind how it works. There's something called the general number field sieve that lets you do that. And he was curious, so he just let it run, and he let it run on his computer, and it took him 2 months, but he actually did factor one of the keys. And then he published that fact, and TI threatened him. They legally threatened him. They actually, if I recall, they actually came to his, or they, not them, but they sent someone to come to his house and ask him to stop. And that scared the absolute crap out of him. So he disappeared as far as that was concerned. Yeah. But because he published the fact that he did it, we knew it could be done. We kind of dismissed the idea a long time ago that it was even possible. But the fact that he had revisited it and did it, we knew it was possible. So at that point, we took it upon ourselves to come up with a distributed computing project. And we had hundreds of people in the community, maybe thousands, all working to try to factor the remaining keys as fast as we possibly could. And at the time, there were a total of 15 keys, 15 512-bit keys. And one of them TI actually gave us. That was the one that allowed us to create Flash applications on the TID3 Plus series. But they hadn't released any OS keys, and they hadn't released the application key for any other calculator. And at the time, there were 7 models that were Flash upgradable. And so that would be 2 keys for each of those, because you have the Flash application key, and then you have the operating system key. So that's 14. And then a common shared date stamp key. So that's 15 total. And we already had one, and that guy had factored one. So there were 13 left. And we had factored all 13 of them inside of a month using that distributed computing project.
Which now you knew that TI did not want you to do.
Absolutely. They were not a fan of that. We managed to get all 13 done before they found out about it. And so once we had those, and And, at the time, there weren't really any tools to utilize these OS keys because no one had ever had an OS key. Why would you need a tool to sign an operating system? Because we've never had the key. So I had to write those tools to make that work. And once I did, I published that application and the keys that you would need to use with it. And TI did not like that. And they threatened me instead.
Wait. How old were you at this point? Or where were you? Were you in college? Were you in high school? What was happening in your life at this point?
I was out of college, maybe a year or two out of college.
But you'd been playing with these since high school?
Yeah.
Okay.
Middle school, actually.
Since middle school. Okay, so year or two out of college, TI is now banging on your door saying no.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to not be visited personally. They actually just sent me a DMCA takedown notice telling me to stop.
Okay, what is a DMCA takedown notice for people who aren't in the U.S. and don't know?
The DMCA stands for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and it's basically a law that states that if you believe your copyright's being violated by somebody, you can send a notice, what's called a takedown notice to them, informing them that they are violating your copyright and that they need to stop. And if they do not, they have a certain time frame to comply, and if they do not, you can sue them. And so they sent me that because I had published their secret private signing keys for all of their applications and all of their operating systems.
But these were just numbers. They're just numbers.
Exactly.
How do you copyright a number?
Because
I have copyrighted 42 and you all owe me a lot of money.
Well, I think part of the argument, and I don't know, I haven't followed this in a long time, but it used to be that just breaking a protection was a violation of the DMCA. Not that you had necessarily published anything copywritten, but just that you'd given people the means by which they could.
Yeah. And
that was the argument, I guess.
There is an exemption that says, in the interest of interoperability, you are allowed to do certain things. And writing our own operating system from scratch, not using any of their copyrighted code, but just repurposing the hardware for our own means is something that we wanted to do, and we felt that we had a right to do. So,
for interoperability.
Yes.
Okay.
And so they sent me that notice, which, that scares the crap out of anyone when they get a notice like that. But, and I'm trying to think back to exactly how the circumstances happened, but there was a journalist that got involved at one point who wanted to publish a story about the fact that they had threatened me, and they published it. And that journalist contacted the EFF on my behalf. And the EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They are a nonprofit group that it's basically like the ACLU for digital rights. They protect people who are being legally threatened in circumstances like this. So they contacted the EFF on my behalf, and then the EFF reached out to me and said, "Hey, this is a travesty. I hate this for you. Do you want to do something about it? We can help you." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely."
Well, before they had reached out, what were you going to do? Were you going to take it down? Were you going to go to court? What was your plan?
I was going to take it down. There was nothing I could do. And that's what the EFF does. They, for people in exactly that situation that feel like there's nothing they can do, that they step in.
So was this an early or late test case of the DMCA?
I'm not sure. The DMCA has been around for quite some time, so I'm sure it was not new at the time.
Okay.
But the idea of copyrighting a number, and especially threatening someone over a calculator, that's kind of what made the news at the time was, what, this guy wants to put his own OS on a calculator. Why are you threatening? Why are you harassing him? Just leave him alone. It's just a number. So they said that they would write a letter on my behalf to TI saying, "Look, this is a number. You can't copyright a number. Your claim is ridiculous. Leave this guy alone." And I never heard another word about it. So the keys are still up on my website to this day. They have not sued me. They've not done anything. And if they had, the EFF would have continued to support me. But since they didn't, the matter was dropped.
So looking at it from TI's perspective, they have been trying to get into schools for a long time to say that their calculators are cheat-proof. And should be used on tests. And now you're helping people defeat some of their preventative things. How do you balance that? Was that ever part of your consideration?
It was never my goal to help people, to help them cheat or to help them circumvent those types of protections. It is my goal to point out some of the flaws with what they've done. So, for example, that Testguard thing, where the fact that you have to be near a computer to unlock it, I think that's going a little too far. I think that's a little unreasonable. I think there are other solutions that could be done instead to get around that.
What other solutions?
Well, they could have calculators in the classroom that are configured in a particular way. Maybe they're running a different operating system where that feature can't be turned off, so that student calculators are not susceptible to just any old person who wants to come and unlock it. Or maybe there is something where only you install some sort of certificate or something, so only your teacher can unlock it. And that's something day one, when you come into the classroom, you have to connect your calculator to your teacher's setup, and it's kind of tied to them. And only they can trigger those types of restrictions, so that just not anybody can do it with a simple key combination or whatever. There's lots of different ways that they could enforce that instead of making it less secure for me. It's just wide open for me or for anyone else who gets their hands on my calculator for even a second.
Yeah, you can imagine some student grabbing your calculator before an exam and doing something nefarious to it, and then you're out of luck for, yeah.
But as an engineer, I can see thinking, oh, well, we have to have this special mode. Oh, well, how do we let the student get out of this mode?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. We can't have another key code. That doesn't make sense. I can see how they ended up with you have to plug it in.
I think part of the mistake is thinking of this as protecting the calculator or protecting from cheating as their problem. Because it does kind of push it away from the schools to say, oh, you can have whatever you want, students, whatever calculator you use, and we'll just depend on TI to protect it.
Well, I mean, that's a horrendous problem.
Oh.
How do you...
Well, I mean, he was suggesting having dedicated calculators.
Yeah. You'd think TI would have gone in for that solution because it would have...
They sold more calculators. I mean, that's a problem too, is it costs the schools more money. But
I mean, these calculators cost like $150 at most for the ones that are used in high school, and you're asking every student to have one of those.
That's true.
And so and I can tell you, it costs way less to manufacture them than that.
They're using Z80s. Yeah. It costs way less.
Well, they have new Z80s.
Easy 80s.
Yeah. I can see how they got there, but I also don't see why that they're still having this problem. They are still having this problem, aren't they?
Yeah, that's where the cat and mouse game comes in, and that's why this talk at Hardware.io I'm giving that's why it's called the race to secure Texas Instruments graphic calculators, because they want to secure them against students who want to cheat or do whatever. But you also have the users who want to use them the way that they want to use them. It's hardware that they own and they paid a lot of money for. I mean, imagine being in high school and that's all you have is that calculator, or and you want to be able to do what you want with it, not just for running things, but maybe you want to do your own research and your own programming. And I think they're fantastic devices for learning programming and reverse engineering. And I might be a little biased on that front, but I think it's just fantastic. I've seen so many students grow up, programming for these things and learning low-level fundamentals that it's just hard to get anywhere else. And I've seen so many people move on, and this, again, this was a long time ago, but I saw a lot of them move on to Game Boy programming and just start careers based on what they learned in that community. So you can learn an awful lot from these things. It's a lot more than just, doing math.
Oh, especially the way you're doing it with learning operating systems and assembly and how all this stuff works, and maybe making your own compiler with Forth or doing another version of BASIC. You would learn a ton from these calculators.
If you can imagine it, it's been done in the community. I can tell you there have been alternatives to TI Basic. People have made their own programming languages, kind of a hybrid between BASIC and assembly. There are people who have they've actually made Game Boy emulators on something that is not much more powerful than a Game Boy. I mean, the optimizations that people have come up with and the way that they've made grayscale games and color games on things that don't have dedicated video, they don't have dedicated gaming graphics or anything. This is stuff that they need every instruction cycle matters. Every cycle matters. So they optimize them in ways that are just unheard of. There's really some just ingenious stuff in the library of applications that are out there.
How much responsibility do people have to tell the company of gaps or found RSA keys before telling the world about them?
They have some responsibility. That's always a complicated question. There's always a gray area. I mean, there are some things that are 100% wrong you should not do, and there are some things that are 100% right that you should do. And then there's the area in between. So, like these signing keys, for example, maybe at the time, maybe there was a middle ground where you kind of keep the keys under wraps, but you make it so that people can write their own operating systems easily and install it on their own calculators. There are methods of making it so that you could come up with a system where you could sign certificate updates on calculators so that people, kind of like it's like making developer keys, so that people could make their own operating systems on their own without affecting anything else. And maybe they have to submit them to, I don't know, a calculator community authority, and that they actually sign them. Maybe you don't make the tools public. Maybe you keep certain aspects under wraps. Maybe you don't release the exploits. Maybe you just release the tools that use the exploits. Maybe you obfuscate the code somehow. I mean, there's a million different things that could be done. And it's just, I really think it depends on the circumstances and the state of, at least in a graphing calculator example, the state of the community at the time, our relationship with TI, what they're trying to protect against at that time, what we're trying to preserve as far as rights at that time. It's just very complicated. It's based on a number of factors that it's just very circumstance or scenario specific.
Yeah, and calculators are a good scenario because on one hand, who the hell cares? On the other hand, who's responsible for that civil engineer having a bridge fall down because they cheated on their test?
Yeah.
It goes both ways. And so it seems low stakes, but there are high stakes, at least theoretical examples. I mean, I don't know of any bridges falling down, but... Well,
due to that, anyway.
Due to that.
I would like to think that if somebody's cheating on an Algebra 1 test, that they will never get to a position where they are solely responsible for their bridge is going to collapse or not. I would hope there's a system of checks and balances that prevents that kind of thing from happening. But, who knows? I don't know.
It's funny because thinking about when I had a calculator in class, which was not that long before you, I had an HP 48, which did all this similar stuff, and you could program it, and it would graph things. And I think there was a hacker community around that even at that time.
Oh, yeah.
And school didn't care, and nobody checked it. And that was true for college and grad school. And it's I never cheated with it because there's why. But
there are easier ways to cheat than to learn assembly.
Not where I was headed. But yeah, it's interesting to me that attitudes change and different schools have different attitudes. And yeah, it's a tough question because on some level, one solution is just to make the exam so hard that it doesn't matter if you can cheat, which is what happened in some of my classes. It was like, yeah, you have a calculator? Great. go nuts, do whatever you want with it because you're doomed no matter what. But you obviously can't do that for 8th grade Algebra 1. There's no way to make the exam so hard that a calculator can't help you if you could cheat. So anyway.
Okay, so back to responsibilities. Are there examples of hacks that have gone public that you're uncomfortable with, that you wish that they had talked to the company first?
Speaking generally or about calculators?
Generally, I'm having trouble. Well, actually, about calculators, if you have any, but then generally, because I'm having trouble picturing that.
With calculators, I I don't think so. I would say the one circumstance that kind of bothered me was, I always take the position that you should, if you have an exploit that is good and can help the community as a whole, and you think it will help more than hurt, you should put it out and you should make it so people can use it. But there is a responsibility to make sure that you do things correctly, because it is possible to brick these calculators. There was one project of mine where I was trying to find out if you could permanently brick it. Is there something you can do that would make it, from a software perspective, that would make it so you could never ever use it again? And which is very, very hard to do, but it turns out there is a way you can do it. And so there's a responsibility not to release that. But there's also it's also good to let the information out there that it can be done, and that this is a particular aspect of the hardware that you should not be messing with because it has the potential to do that. Like on the calculators, there's an area of memory called the certificate. It's a particular flash sector that the boot code actually parses and scans. And if you are able to corrupt it in a very particular way, you can cause the boot code to crash. So if you erase your operating system and the boot code attempts to parse that invalid certificate before it attempts to receive a new operating system, then it can never receive one. So that is one thing that would be really bad. But there's also advantages to being able to manipulate the certificate, and the certificate's a privileged area, so you have to use one of these exploits in order to modify it in any way. And one of the things you can do is you can install new keys in there. So instead of factoring TI's operating system keys, you can install your own operating system key. And that's actually something that happened right before the keys were factors. We figured out that we could do that. And so we made it so you could install your own generated OS key in the certificate. That way you alone could install whatever custom OS you wanted. And through doing that, we had to release a program that had an unlock exploit in it so people could disassemble it and figure out what it was and use it and reuse it. And you had to have the code out there that would actually erase the certificate and install a new one. And so that's scary. And if somebody took that and disassembled it and modified it in a way that they didn't quite understand, and then released it, they've released something that malicious that can brick other people's calculators. And I can think of one case where one person thought they understood what they were doing and took code very similar to that and released something that had the potential to majorly screw up the memory on the flash chip. And I thought that was irresponsible of that person, but I also lay some blame because I'm the one who put the exploit out there that made it possible for him to do it. So that's just one of those gray areas where I don't know, it was a bad thing that happened and I have some responsibility for it, and so does the other person. But that one case, all the good things that the community gets from that far outweighs that one little incident.
You do more hacking than this, though.
More than calculators, yeah.
I've always wondered about bug bounties. Do they work? Is it just a way for the company to say, yes, we're doing stuff? Is it a way for the company to pay off people so that so the exploits aren't publicized? Do bug bounties, are they real or fake?
I don't know. I've never been a part of one.
Oh, okay.
I have no interest in being a part of one. It's just not for me. I don't need money to do what I like to do. I'm sure there are people out there that do it for money, but I'm not one of them. I'm sure it does bring in more people than if they didn't have one, but is it worth it? I don't know. My opinion is no, but I don't know. I guess it depends on the environment and the community and the circumstances. Like for much bigger communities and uses, like say game consoles or something, maybe it does matter. But for calculators, no, it certainly doesn't matter.
Okay, so other projects that you have maybe solved your own hardware problems by modifying in software in ways that maybe the manufacturer didn't intend.
The calculators kind of provided a good starting point for being able to do stuff with other types of devices, mainly because the processors that the calculators use are used in so many other things. You've got the Z80, you've got the Motorola 68K. Those are used in a lot of things that people don't even realize. Like the Sega Genesis, for example, it used a Motorola 68K. Old Macs used that. And even the PCMs, the computers inside older cars, used that processor. And so I've done projects using both of those that have those processors in them. Just as one example, and this is one project I'll be talking about at hardware.io, is the Sega Genesis. If you remember that old console, it actually, a lot of people don't know this, but it actually has two processors in it. It has a Motorola 68K. That's the main processor that it uses. And then it also has a Zilog Z80 as a sound coprocessor. And those are two processors that I know very well from the calculators. And there was a particular project that came up involving the Genesis that involved dumping the ROM of a game, a particular game that came out not too long ago. I guess it's been maybe 8 years ago, way after the console died. And there was a group of homebrew developers for the Genesis that really wanted to make their own game, and not just make it to run in an emulator. They wanted to actually run it on real hardware. And the way they did that is they made a game that was larger than what the Genesis could actually support. So the Genesis can only support a 4 megabyte ROM, but they actually made a game that was 8 megabytes. And not only did they make the game, but they came up with special hardware that they could put in a real Genesis cartridge. So they were going to manufacture the cartridge, manufacture that hardware, and install the game on it, and mass produce that and sell that to people. And that's what they did. But one of the things they did is they made it pretty much impossible to dump the ROM on it. They had circuitry in it that would defeat most hardware devices that dump Genesis ROMs, as well as other means of dumping ROMs that people use. And so they came out with this game, and they mass produced it. They released it. They did one run of it, and then did nothing else with it. They had no intentions of releasing any more copies of the game. It was a very expensive game. And once they had sold out, that was it. Nobody could play that game anymore. So only the few hundred people who actually had a copy of it were the only ones who could run it, which bothered me. So I wanted to be able to dump the ROM, because there are lots of other people who might want to be able to play the game. And so I managed to get my hands on one of these cartridges, and I was going to go about dumping the ROM on it. Well, the big problem with dumping the ROM on it is that extra circuitry that's in the cartridge. They actually have hardware in there that checks to make sure that the game is actually running in a real Genesis. So you can't put it in a hardware ROM dumper and just dump the ROM that way. The game actually has to be running and executing normally in order to be able to access all of the data on the data in the ROM. And so when I learned this and I realized that you couldn't just dump it through normal means, I knew that I was probably going to have to find a way to get code execution on the console in order to actually dump the ROM. And since the Genesis has two processors in it that I'm very familiar with, this seems like a good project. So that's when I got into it. And I tried all number of different things. But essentially what it came down to is I had to get code execution on it by connecting a Sega CD attachment to the Genesis. So that lets you – it's basically a CD attachment for the Genesis. And so you can actually burn a CD of code and put it right in there, and it will run it. So code execution is very easy in that setup. And I had to embed a ROM dumper in RAM, in memory, on the console while it's on. And once I did that, I hooked a Game Genie and the game together and plugged that into the system while it's on, and then reset it, which causes it to start executing the Game Genie little ROM, which has like a code selection screen. It's what lets you cheat in games. It came with a little manual, and you could enter a bunch of codes, and it would patch the game in memory. So whenever the console went to fetch data from the actual cartridge, if it was from a particular address, it would return a different value instead. That's all those codes would do. They would just return a different value. And so through doing that, I could patch the game to actually jump into my code and run it, my ROM dumping code. So once the game had actually started and done all the setup stuff that it needed to do in order to access it, I could get code execution and then simply dump the ROM out one of the controller ports back to a computer or something. So when I did that, once I did do that, and once I did that, I still wasn't able to get access to the full ROM, and I couldn't understand why. And the reason why is because the cartridge hardware is actually expecting instructions to be fetched from the cartridge all the time. And when I got code execution, it was just executing my code in RAM. So while my code's sitting and running in RAM, the game's not running, which means instructions aren't being fetched from the cartridge, and that protection circuitry kicks in. So what I had to do was use the Game Genie to lock the game up. I had to patch an instruction in there so it would just jump at the beginning of its little ROM over and over again and enter an infinite loop. And while it was doing that, I could use the sound processor. I had a little ROM dumper running in its RAM, and it would dump it out the controller port. So while the main processor is sitting there locked up, it's spinning its wheels, the sound processor is dumping the ROM out. And so that was the way that game was dumped.
Okay, this story started with homebrew developers, like hackers that developed a game.
Mm-hmm. Those people are hardcore Genesis fans. They love the Genesis, just like I love calculators. They loved Genesis. They wanted to be able to make a really impressive game, the most impressive Genesis game there ever was, and they did succeed because it is technically the most impressive game for the Genesis.
Because it doesn't fit in the Genesis.
Yeah, exactly. And as I recall, the cartridge hardware also had some extra graphics processing in it, so it was not only could it not fit in the Genesis, but it was more than the Genesis was actually capable of. Yeah. So it actually had it was almost a console extension through the cartridge. And not only that, but it had a serial EEPROM that it was using to save game data. So, most old consoles like that, they have a battery that keeps RAM, But this game didn't have that because it would actually store it in a serial EEPROM. So there were a lot of firsts for this game, and they wanted to protect all that.
Have they come after you and gone after your calculators?
No.
Retaliatory strike.
I'm certain they didn't like it, but and the thing about that game is because there's so much extra processing that's done in the cartridge hardware, a regular old Genesis PC emulator can't run it because it doesn't have support for any of that extra hardware. And some of the Genesis homebrew developers that were working on that game had also been the ones responsible for creating those emulators. And they did not, because they had all the circuitry in there, they did not want people to be able to run that game in an emulator. So not only did the emulators not have support for it, they actually publicly stated they will never add support for that game to their emulator because they don't want them to be able to run it in an emulator. So once I had the ROM dumped, not only did I dump the ROM, but then I modified an open source Genesis emulator to support that game.
It was because you need hardware to run it. So it doesn't do you any good to have just the software, but now you can run it on an emulator. Yeah.
Communities are weird.
Communities are very weird. I mean, okay. Hackers and hackers all the way down.
So let me ask you a question. What is your career that you actually do make money from now?
I was a software developer for over 10 years, and I recently transitioned into security consulting. Okay. So that's kind of my day job. Yeah, it's kind of my day job, but I'm not sure there's a job that matches all this type of stuff.
Well, where I was headed was, do you think you would be doing what you do now had you not discovered and gotten into the calculators?
I doubt it. I think calculators changed my life. I think that they made my life, and I don't regret one bit of it. I'm very glad that all of it happened, and I would do it over again.
And when you say you're a security consultant, what does that mean? Like, can I ask you my IoT security questions?
It's web application penetration testing.
Oh.
Yeah, that's why
I'm sure that's very exciting.
Yeah. That's why I say it's my day job. I like to work on these things in my spare time because there's no pressure. There's no deadlines. There's no pressure. You just do it. You do it until it works. And I like that aspect of it. And I'm not sure I necessarily want to change that.
Are you still working on the calculators, or do you have other hardware that is more modern that you're interested in?
Plenty modern. There's the new Z80.
Okay, well, how about this? How about this for a question? This came up in the Slack channel. How can TI be charging this much for calculators that haven't changed in 20 years?
Yeah. I get that question a lot. I never have an answer. I don't know. Why would you change it? I mean, they're making a killing. Why would you not?
Nobody's because people haven't stopped buying them. That's the answer.
Yeah.
I think the educational department is their most profitable department.
Yeah, not a surprise.
So. I hope they get a discount.
But back to the original question. Is there anything you're working on now that's, or do you still work on calculators?
I do still work on calculators, not as much as I used to. The calculators, another aspect, other than just the fact that they have processors that are used in other things, another aspect of the calculators is the fact that they, a lot of the newer ones have USB ports. And I learned an awful lot about USB just through the calculators. They have a very flexible USB controller in them that is, I don't want to say rare, but it's not as common as you would hope in other devices. And you can do things, you can abuse the protocol on the USB protocol using its controller in ways that you just can't with other devices. And I don't know if we have time to get into it, but there was years ago, way back when the PlayStation 3 first got its quote unquote jailbreak. It was the first public exploit that allowed you to run your own code on it. There was an exploit that came out that was USB related, and it involved involved plugging in a device that simulated a USB hub, and it would virtually attach and detach different USB devices in a very particular order in order to trigger a memory corruption exploit. And there was a very limited number of devices. Pretty much the Teensy at the time was the only device that could do it. There's a very limited number of devices that could do that in hardware. And so naturally, when that came out, Teensies all over the world sold out. Nobody could get them, but people still wanted to do this. So I knew that the calculator was capable of doing it. So I re-implemented that on the calculator. So basically, you could use your calculator as a jailbreak the PlayStation 3. So, and the way that worked was the device was the calculator, the controller, USB controller in the calculator was capable of changing its own device address, which is not something that a lot of devices can necessarily do.
You're not supposed to do that.
Yeah, you're not supposed to do that. And so and if you're going to simulate a hub, a USB hub, that's one of the things you need to be able to do, because when you first attach a hub, it connects on address 0, and then the host negotiates with it, sets it up, and tells it, okay, now you're address 1 or 2 or whatever. And so it's no longer address 0, it's that new address. And then as you plug in a new device on that hub, it has address 0, which is the default address. And then the hub says, okay, well, you're address 2. And then it connects another address and goes, okay, you're address 3. Well, this calculator could actually say, okay, I'm a new device on this hub, and it could actually switch to address 0. So then the host would talk to it as though it were another device attached to the hub, even though it's really not. And then once it was done doing that, it would then switch back to the hub and say, okay, now I've got another device attached. And then it would switch back to address 0, and then it would set up that address, and then it would switch back to the hub and say, okay, now I've got another device. And then it would keep on doing that to trigger the exploit. So long story short, I learned an awful lot about USB through this. And I started to work on other projects, other USB-related projects because of it. And one of them was modifying the firmware on USB flash drives, because there is a subset of USB flash, very cheap USB flash drives out there that have no code signing protections, nothing at all like that at all. And you can update the firmware on them.
Yes. I don't put these in my computer, but yes. Anybody who gives you a free USB flash drive, no, that's just bad.
Yeah. And you can modify the firmware on them, and without having to deal with, cracking any keys or anything like that. And so I started to get into that. And one of the things you have to do in order to replace the firmware on it is you're probably going to either need to patch the one that's there, or if you have it, or if you can dump it. And on some of them you can, some of them you can't. And you're going to have to re-implement the firmware from scratch. Well, to do that, you really need to understand some pretty low-level aspects of USB. You're going to have to disassemble the firmware. You're going to have to understand how it interacts with its USB controller. You're going to have to know everything about that. And not only that, but all the communication with the NAND flash chip in it. There's an awful lot of stuff that has to be done in order to replace the firmware in that. And one of the things I would like to do is to come up with general purpose firmware that would work not just on that one particular drive, but on the vast majority of drives that have no code signing protection at all. And there are way more than you might think. Pretty much any drive you can get for $5, it's probably going to be susceptible to this. And so I think it would be really valuable to have general purpose firmware so that you could replace the firmware that's on there. You could add features to it, like you could add encrypted drive support to it. You could make it show up as different things. You could be like a rubber ducky type thing. So you could have it pretend to be a USB keyboard and type out scripts. So when you plug it into a computer, you could do whatever, install tools, take control of it. So there's just a huge wealth of things that you could do with it if you had the ability to change it.
But do these have the ability to change their firmware? Isn't this just ROM code?
Yes, they do. The firmware is actually stored on the NAND chip. So when the device first starts up, it does have a little ROM in it that it uses to determine is there firmware for me to boot. It has a basic NAND chip communication, so it checks to see if it's there, and if it is, it loads it into RAM and runs it. But if not, it goes into a special mode where it waits to receive new firmware. So a lot of them actually do have firmware updates. You never hear about it because why would you need to update the firmware on a USB flash drive? But there are tools out there that let you do it, and it can be done easily.
So some of these USB drives that I might use, except they flash, I could just learn their firmware and then change it so that they didn't flash.
Yeah.
Or I could continue with the electrical tape.
Seems cheaper, or at least less time consuming.
The firmware actually, it has some special commands in it that it will interpret. And if you send one of those commands to it, it will jump into its boot ROM and allow you to send any code you want to it. It doesn't have to be new firmware. You could just run code in RAM. It could be a one-time thing, a runtime thing. It doesn't have to be permanent. There's lots of things you can do with it, and I think a lot of people don't know that. So getting that word out there, which I think would help with the trustworthiness of these flash drives, but also repurposing them. I mean, like this whole idea of adding encryption to them, you could obsolete these really expensive, FIPS encrypted drives that they charge an arm and a leg for. You could actually do that yourself using flash drives you already have. All you have to do is imagine if you could just run a program and you could change the firmware on it, and you'd have the same functionality that you get from one of these really expensive drives.
Are you writing that up somewhere, or is it somewhere? I know you have a blog. Are you talking about that on the blog already?
I've given some talks at conferences about the idea of it. I did release years ago. I released some code that for a very particular manufacturer of flash drive controller and a very particular revision from that manufacturer that would allow you to change the firmware on it, and it had from scratch firmware, from scratch replacement firmware for that particular drive. But what I don't have released yet, and really haven't even started yet, is the general purpose firmware that would work not only for all the revisions of drives from that manufacturer, but from all the others as well. I know it can be done. I've done some basic research into them all. I know that they have no code signing protections. I know that you can change them. I just don't have anything written or even started as far as adding support to the others.
Well, it'll make a nice white paper for your consulting company. One more question. We talked about IDA, the disassembler. Mm-hmm. And I had a couple of people ask about binwalk and hexinator and 010 and radar re2. Do you know about those tools? What are they? And where do I go to get them, and what do I use them for?
You can use those tools to learn more, like binwalk. I heard you say you can use that to learn more about binaries. You can learn more about what's in them. They have a lot of built-in tests to look for different signatures of things you might typically find. I find those tools more useful for things that are kind of well known. For example, routers. A lot of routers run some sort of small version of Linux that you can run these tools against, and they will quickly tell you where these signatures are and how where these things are stored, and give you some clues as to how it boots them and how you can change them and that kind of thing. So I think those tools are more useful for devices like that. What I do is I tend to focus on devices that are weird, so that are so weird that you can't just slap Linux on it. It's something somebody custom wrote, something that is completely unknown. Just because I find them more interesting. I think that if nobody knows anything about it and it's truly a black box, then kind of everybody's on the same level playing field, and it's just more challenging and more interesting that way. But as far as those tools, you can get them from Google. I mean, they're a lot of them, if not all of them, are open source tools that you can get easily enough.
I have never used them, and I look at them, and I guess I have used like Dump. How would you say that?
Dump.
Okay. And other things like that to look at my code to make sure it was organized or secured properly. But
you're not usually reversing something.
I know, but sometimes I want to.
Well, we have a whole house full of things.
Yes. Although, Brandon, I do have a request for you. Please don't mess with any of my devices.
Oh, I will not. I'll do my best.
Although the Leapfrog toys, you could go take those apart. They were fun. 8051s too.
That's, believe it or not, the flash drives, that's the processor they have. It's an 8051. So all that firmware is written in 8051.
These chips are never going to go away.
Why would they when they cost 2 pennies?
Yeah. Well, we should go back to our days. Chris, do you have any more questions?
We should probably ask about the conference.
Right. You mentioned the Hardware.io conference in September, mid-September in The Hague in Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And you're doing a hardware hacking village and a talk?
Yes, the talk is on graphic calculators. It's called The Race to Secure Texas Instruments Graphic Calculators. It's kind of a very technical, historical overview of how things started and how we got to where we are and where we hopefully want to go. And the village is about that Genesis game, about dumping the ROM of it. There will be a setup where you can hopefully dump it yourself, because it's a very complicated procedure. You know, I kind of ran through it really quickly earlier, where you have to plug things in at a certain time and you have to manually enter Game Genie codes. I mean, it's very complicated. So I think it would be interesting for somebody to kind of step through that themselves and see how to trigger it and get a better understanding of how it works and why it works and what you could do to stop it.
Is there anything you're looking forward to attending at the conference? I
haven't looked at the other talks that closely, but I am sure that they're interesting. I am very excited to go and talk to different people and kind of share knowledge and swap stories. I think it's going to be just a ton of interesting people, and they all have their own stories and perspectives that you just would really want to hear. And I think that a lot of people think this stuff is kind of out of their reach, and it's really not. It's really not. The only reason I know so much about calculators is because I've wasted a lot of time since middle school doing it. Anybody can do it. It's just a matter of how motivated you are and what information you can get access to and the people you can talk to. And once you kind of get over that hump, anybody can learn anything. And I'm excited to learn a little sliver of what it is that they know.
Well, and it'd be a lot easier to learn about calculators now with the internet being more available than it would have been in 1997. Oh
yeah, I actually there I mentioned if it's possible to do it with a calculator, you can do it. You actually have Telnet for the calculators. way back when, before USB ports and Wi-Fi attachments and stuff like that, you could actually attach the I/O port on the calculator straight to a modem and dial in to wherever you wanted and check your email at the time, whatever it is you want it to do. So if you can think of it, it's been done on the calculators.
Bitcoin mining.
Not yet.
That's so we're getting
not yet.
Well, Brandon, do you have any thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Maybe just a piece of advice for anyone who's getting into this stuff. don't be afraid to work on something. Just because you think you might get in trouble or you think you don't know enough to figure it out or whatever, don't let that stop you. There's so many projects I've worked on that I knew absolutely nothing about it when I started, and you could argue I still don't. You can take really weird approaches that people would laugh at you if you described it to them. They just won't believe it, and don't let that stuff stop you. Every time I go to talk somewhere, that's always been my final thought. Don't let people stop you. You can do it, and it doesn't matter what anyone else has to say. If it makes sense to you in your mind and you believe it can be done, do it, because those are the most worthwhile projects, and I can tell you it's definitely worth it.
That's great. Our guest has been Bradon Wilson, software developer and application security consultant. He will be at Hardware.io conference next week in The Hague, talking about the race to secure Texas Instruments graphing calculators and that Sega Genesis hardware hacking village. Thank you for being with us, Bradon.
Thank you.
Thank you to the folks at Hardware.io for connecting me to Bradon. Thank you to the Patreon supporters for Brandon's mic. Thank you also to Particle.io for their Spectra conference coupons and giveaway. Don't forget to contact me if you want those. You have until September 15th. Of course, there will be numerous links in the show notes if you want to know more. Check out your podcast app or embedded.fm. Finally, thank you to Christopher for producing and co-hosting, and you for listening. You can always contact us at show@embedded.fm or hit the contact link on that embedded.fm website. And now, a quote to leave you with, this one from Wikipedia. The name, pronounced with a long I, is an acronym of Z integrated logic, also thought of as Z for the last word of integrated logic. That was, of course, on the Zilog page. Embedded is an independently produced radio show that focuses on the many aspects of engineering. It is a production of Logical Elegance, an embedded software consulting company in California. If there are advertisements in the show, we did not put them there and do not receive money from them. At this time, our sponsors are Logical Elegance and listeners like you.